My husband and I run a childcare business. We've been in business for 15 years.
The kids are awesome, and meeting all the families in our community is a phenomenal opportunity for us to engage the community and be a part of the upbringing of their children.
Our philosophy is all kids matter, because they do. And when they leave here, we want them to know that this is always a safe place they can come back to.
My wife and I started looking at the system that the state was trying to build and how the union was engaged with that. And I looked at the numbers from decades past, and since the union became involved and the Department of Early Learning was created, we've lost more child care providers than any time in our state's history. Being in the child care industry, you're pretty isolated as a business owner, working a lot of hours in your home and your business. And so we asked for information on how to get a hold of all the daycare providers in the state.
We go through the legislative bills that come up through the legislature every session and go over the wording to make sure, how is it going to affect childcare providers? How is it going to affect the businesses? How is it going to affect the families? We finally decided to put together newsletters that would go out to the other businesses in the industry.
We continued to get the newsletters out using the information that we had gotten through public disclosure, and suddenly we were told that we were not going to get that information because SEIU had filed an injunction and a suit.
The feeling was just kind of unexplainable. You kind of just take a deep breath and you kind of think, I'm just a small business owner that loves kids. Why would they do this? I don't think it's right that other child care associations and SEIU themselves can have the information and they would block one of the own people that they're supposed to be representing from contacting other people in the industry.
We knew that we couldn't go to the union for help in the union suing us, which was odd that my wife was a member of a union that attacked her for simply connecting with other union dues paying members. And so Freedom Foundation stepped in, and it was amazing how quickly the union pulled back and realized that they had overstepped their bounds in attacking their own membership.
We were very relieved when the Freedom Foundation stood up for us, and they did exactly what they said that they were going to do, and we are grateful for that.
So we will start with who is responsible for selling your children and grandchildren's future, and that is the Department of Early Learning. What is the Department of Early Learning? Well, it was created in 2006. It was the first cabinet-level agency in the United States for birth to 5-year-olds. They are the enforcement and the regulator for family home child care and child care centers. They have statewide executive branch administrative code writing authority, funds and operates the Early Childhood Education and Assistance Program, ECAP. That's the state-run program that competes with the private sector. What is the big issue and conflict in our state? The agency that regulates private child care also operates the state-funded free competition. How can the private sector compete with free? Well, it can't. So why was the department created, this Department of Early Learning, DEL? The actual legislation that created the department stated that the legislative intent was to increase access to child care services. Or was it? In an article written by Jamie Lund of the Freedom Foundation, he's the education analyst there, and he explains that the state is pressing child care into a monopoly mold. Jamie Lund is spot on in this article. He also points out the closure of the child cares and the lack of options for families. In order to usher in a full monopoly, the Department of Early Learning must create a shortage and a crisis to demand funding to fix the problem that they have been creating. We've personally experienced the overregulation and the bureaucratic takeover, which has caused a dramatic decline in childcare. In 1996, there was 10,600 licensed independent childcare businesses in the state of Washington. According to the survey, the Washington Child Care Survey, March of 2006, we see that it's declined to just 5,800. In November 2007, less than 5,000 remained. And as you see there, in September of 2014, the number has declined again to 3,800 private in-home child cares. According to the census, there are more children in our state today than there was in 1996. But obviously there's far less services in the private sector. So what we see in less than 20 years is that there's actually a loss of 6,800 private child cares. With overregulation, inconsistency in licensing, and the state has actually caused the largest decline in child care services in our state's history. So data proves that the real intent must have been that they were created to destroy the private sector businesses and create the shortage to implement a government-run birth to 5 system. In a recent debate, presidential candidate Carly Fiorina stated this, and she nailed it: socialism starts when government creates a problem and then government steps in to solve the problem. This is exactly what's happened here. This next map here shows the decline of child care capacity just from 2009 to 2013 in commercial child care centers and in-home businesses. As you see, there's a loss in every county in the state except 3 of our 39 counties, where the Department of Early Learning helped fund some of those services. So what's been hard to nail down is how many facilities have been funded by the state and by school districts. But we do know that they're popping up around the state, and here's a few examples. In March of 2015, the Pasco School District requested $7.5 million to add to its own $7.5 million. So the state awarded them that money, and their $7.5 million came from local tax levies and other district accounts. This pre-K center will serve 900 4-year-olds and is set to open in September of this year. Here in Spokane, we have school districts: Central Valley, Spokane Public Schools, Millwood, Cheney District, and other government-run options. We also have a new facility, Barker High School and CV Early Learning Center. It's located right next to East Point Church. You may remember this location here. It was the old Yoke store on Sprague and Progress. It was set to open on January 25th. On your tables, there is a sheet of paper that is their flyer that you can pull out and take a look at if you'd like. So the facility outlines required car side service for all children. Also notice the last point: if you are late arriving for drop-off and you must go sign your child in at the office, parents are not allowed to walk their children to class. Parents are not allowed in the building otherwise. So if you're late, you're just supposed to hand off your child to the person at the counter, and you're not allowed to communicate with the teacher about your child's day or anything else. In 2010, a presentation was given by Mary Seaton of the Department of Early Learning, where she announced the ability to redirect basic education funding from Title I funds to early learning initiatives. Title I funds are federal grants that are designed to help states with school districts and educationally at-risk students. The goal of the Title I was to provide extra activities in math, reading, and writing. According to the Washington State Child Care Survey, from 2010 to 2012, we lost 1,500 child cares just in those 2 years. Proponents of the universal pre-K system faced huge difficulties in acquiring the funding to replace this huge loss of private services. So it's created an extreme lack of availability for private sector services. During last year's legislative session, the longest in our state's history, the elephant in the room was the McCleary court decision on basic education funding. According to our state law, basic education is K-12. However, they dumped several $100 million into early learning, which diverted funds from basic education and the smaller classroom size initiative, if you remember the initiative that was passed. So they still put money into early learning because they had to have the money to replace the services that they had destroyed. So let's talk about the takeover model that the state has used. First, they passed legislation and rules for control of the private sector. The Department of Early Learning was given rulemaking authority and added 30 additional pages of regulations over child care businesses. Now they have 92 pages of regulations to follow, some of which violate local building codes and health codes, and they basically make compliance impossible. So then they created new vocabulary. So you can't be a childcare anymore. You have to be an early learning center. It's not daycare, it's early learning. Craft time became curriculum. So then they created a shortage by making entry into childcare difficult, and they also closed down many of the private facilities. Fourth, they've run media campaigns denigrating and creating fear of independent programs who are not participating in their early achievers, while also promoting tax-funded government services that are free and they're state approved. Then they mandated membership into a private sector union that lobbies against them. The last thing is they are working on right now transitioning funding from the current voucher system that allows parents to choose private sector providers to a slot-based system like the public schools, where the state becomes a near monopoly for services. We can see in this example the voucher system gives parents the ability to choose public or private run centers, licensed family home child care providers, or license exempt friends or family for their services. Transitioning away from the current voucher system to a contracted slot-based system, which is what much of the legislation we've seen does, we can see limits put on parental choice, and it basically gives the state the ability to decide who provides services. Understandably, public sector unions have been lobbying tirelessly for birth to college funding, as it will bring millions and millions of dollars into their organizations and add tens of thousands of union dues paying members. So why is government-run childcare dangerous to the future? According to the Health and Human Services Department, decades and billions of dollars have been spent on the federal Head Start program, which is the federal version of our state's ECAP program. The Head Start studies show that government early learning services aren't even effective. Here's the results here on the bottom graph. Only half of the children benefited cognitively, and next to none of them benefited behaviorally while in the program when they were 3 and 4 years old. As you can see here on this batch of numbers, when they were compared to their classmates, there were nearly no benefits at 3rd grade. Cognitively, there was 0 or 1 out of 11 that benefited. Behaviorally, 1 or 2 out of 20 had better outcomes. According to their own research, government-run early learning has a 0 to 10% success rate when measured the very next year when entering kindergarten. The Washington legislature is heavily lobbied by many tax-funded and privately funded organizations like Fight Crime, Invest in Kids. They state that early childhood education reduces crime. They always say that. They even use your local sheriff's departments to testify to say that children will stay out of prison if they go to early learning. But in fact, many studies show the opposite. Children who do not have time with their families and personalized care become unbonded children. There are many studies that show that they're more prone to future incarceration. There are whole books dedicated to unbonded children and the negative psychological effects. So early learning does not improve educational outcomes. Numerous studies prove this. We've seen recent articles in the Washington Post about debunking the earlier is better idea for academic instruction for young children. And the reason is children are not developmentally ready to leave the comfort of home-style care and be abandoned in an institution, as well as an article, The Decline of Play in Preschoolers and the Rise of Sensory Issues. A government-run universal program does not allow caregivers the ability to let children explore in areas where they are curious and growing in knowledge. This is why the Montessori programs are having difficulty with the state's Early Achievers universal program model. Standardized early learning is not respectful of childhood development. Has anyone here ever met a standard child? Another article found in Psychology Today explains the decline of play and the rise of children's mental disorders, claiming that there's a reason why kids are more anxious and depressed than ever is because of the lack of play and exploration. Young children need to be active, free to ask questions, explore, absolutely make mistakes, and learn to how to cope with their feelings. You can't do that in a book. You can't do that with a universal program. So they are left in a building with commercial tile concrete structure where they are continually asked to answer questions and take intrusive and developmentally inappropriate assessments. Also just released is a study from Stanford University referring to the benefits of a late start to kindergarten, yielding positive benefits for children. Washington State just decided to make kindergarten a full-day program. Children are not ready for 6 hours of institutional instruction at age 5. So if a child is in trouble in Washington State, the guideline is that if they need a timeout, it's 1 minute per year of age. But these children are now expected at age 3, 4, or 5 to abandon the things that they may want to explore for nearly an entire workday. Childcare providers are mandated to offer naps to children until the day they enter kindergarten, and then instantly, no naps. Government-run and institutional models mandate ridiculous and absurd changes that are a shock to children. Why is this topic important for families and for freedom? Children are the future of passed on traditional family values. I'm sure many of us have a different view of what that looks like. This is the complete takeover of how children are raised. The way that the law works is that if there is a responsibility and a liability, there becomes an ownership. And then everyone is a stakeholder in how a child is raised. Imagine there being a ballot initiative that stops parents from teaching children about, say, Christmas or Easter. Society could, with that responsibility and liability, decide that only winter break and spring break can be taught to children by their own parents because it's for the greater good. Large corporations and major media outlets are pushing to take parents out of the equation when it comes to what they see as human capital and their future workforce. Why should the parents raise the children for the first 18 years of their life when the state and large corporations can have control from day one? Remember Hillary Clinton's statement, "It takes a village." Well, MSNBC remembers that statement well.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
So let's stop and think about that for just a minute. She just said that we've always had a private notion of children. Your child is yours. We've not had a collective notion. We must break through the idea that kids belong to their parents and family, as she says. We must realize that kids belong to whole communities. Or do they belong to the state of Washington and the Department of Early Learning? Our kids, our business, does it look familiar? You can find these signs all over the country, and here in Spokane, posted at Head Start and ECAP sites, the state-run facilities. This banner was hung in River Park Square. Now, saying this, I believe that there's a fine line between providing services for parents and families and the village mentality, that we, the collective, will raise your children. We need to stop the government idea that they can overstep or plain take over the parents' and families' rights and the choices of future generations. In the next video from the Early Learning House Committee hearing on January 22nd in 2014, you will hear Heather Moss, the Deputy Director of the Department of Early Learning, explain their duty and focus. Take a close look and listen.
Our customers, first and foremost, are the children of Washington State, and we feel it is our duty to take care of those children to the best of our abilities. Child care providers are also customers, but they are the ones that are helping us be custodians of those children while they're in their care. So I think that's important in terms of a focus.
Important in terms of their focus. Did you just hear that? Department of Early Learning just stated that they are the custodian of the children in the state. They feel it's their duty to care for those children to the best of their ability, and that the child care providers are just helping them to be custodians of those children. I was actually in the hearing room when the Department of Early Learning made this statement and this testimony, and what did she just say? I'm thinking, what does that mean? So I left Olympia, I called my wife, I said, grab that audio, I gotta hear that again. So let's hear it again.
Our customers, first and foremost, are the children of Washington State, and we feel it is our duty to take care of those children to the best of our abilities. Childcare providers are also customers, but they are the ones that are helping us be custodians of those children while they're in their care. So I think that's important in terms of a focus.
So that is what we just heard. And what it means is that the state has custodial authority over every child in the state from birth. These statements do not resonate well with Elizabeth Scott. She was a representative in that hearing room. Let's see what she has to say.
Representative Scott?
Yes, Heather, I just want to make sure I understood something that you said at the very beginning of your speech here. Did you say that you or Dell sees themselves as custodians of the children in Washington State? Was that?
Department of Early Learning. I mean, our okay. Primary customers are the children.
Okay, and you said that the home daycare providers are helping Dell, basically.
Absolutely.
So I think that kind of sums up our problem here. According to our state constitution, all political power is inherent in the people. So the political power is on loan from the people to you. So you report to the people, Dell reports to the people, and we do too. We can be unelected this year. So we report to the people.
Representative Scott, do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, how do you resolve within Dell that direct opposite mentality from what they should have? How do you resolve that? That's a direct conflict. I don't know how you could sum that up. But that's a problem. You should be helping the people, not the providers.
Well, I think it's a philosophical question that probably does not. Well, there probably are differing interpretations of that as well. So,
you know, we do have a slide that shows a couple snippets from our statute that give us direction on our charge. You know, the right of health and safety of children receiving early learning services is paramount over the right of any person to provide care. So we interpret that as the children and the families are the customers of DEL, and providers are our partners in delivering that service to the customers. That's how we have focused on our work.
So Elizabeth Scott questions the statements for clarification. The first question was answered. Yes, Dell is the custodian of the children in the state. And Ruth Kagi responded back with, it sounds like a philosophical argument. What you may not have heard was how she said that, or Scott said that it was a constitutional argument. So instead of answering the last questions, how does Dell resolve the opposite mentality that they are the custodians and not the parents? Government relations spokesperson Amy Blondin further explains the legislative statute that was given to the Department of Early Learning when it was turned into the executive branch agency. Here's the RCW. To safeguard and promote health, safety, and well-being of children receiving child care and early learning assistance, comma, and which is paramount over the right of any person to provide care. But that comma is important. In law, commas and punctuation are very important. I'm glad we have someone teaching phonics here today. The comma separates their duty from their power. Their duty is to inspect providers for basic health and safety. Their power is the right to the children over any other person. We've actually seen and fought legislation that would require grandparents to be licensed in order to watch their grandchildren on a regular basis. So here's the Department of Early Learning's vision statement, and it states all children prenatal through 3rd grade. And the reason why it's 3rd grade is compulsory education starts at age 8 currently. So their system partners with families. As Deputy Director of Department of Early Learning says, the children are their customers, and the state has the paramount right over any other person to provide that care. So the state has decided that they need yet another agency to have more rights to the children than the parents and families. So if the families are willing to participate, that's fine, that's okay. If not, Dell has the authority and the right over any other person. So my wife and I have fought with families and other child care providers over the last few years and have defeated government-run universal pre-K legislation. In fact, one piece of legislation that they called the Washington preschool system a few years back would have been a Kickstarter to a multi-billion-dollar agenda. That bill had an $800 million price tag in Washington. But we were able to defeat it. But 2015, The legislative session came back and we saw virtually the same thing with $100 to $200 million for what they called the Early Start Act. It transitioned into the early care and education system because they must tie this to basic education to force the government funding. Here's Representative Scott's floor speech before the passage of this bill.
The lady from the 39th, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the good gentlelady just mentioned, we are talking about the goal of age 0 to 5. From birth. We have heard that in the Early Learning Committee again and again, that they wish to start at day 1. And so I want to make this very clear to every legislator sitting on this floor so that later down the road, when their children and their grandchildren say, why didn't you stop this? They will not be able to say, Madam Speaker, I didn't know. The truth is that this is a massive expansion of collection of data on children from 0 to 5, going into a database that is not securely protected. We know that 40 million federal employees just have their data taken, okay? Do we really think that our ability here at Washington State is stronger than the federal ability to protect their data? It's not. The underlying theory here is that with this citing of brain science data is that if you have a child placed in this kind of care from day 1, that they will have a stronger shot at being a success in life. Think about what that means, Madam Speaker. Do we really want all our children collected into some kind of huge center from day 1? That's not what I want for my children or my grandchildren. And I've lived in countries where they do that, and it's not a pretty sight. It's ugly. It ends up with people who are tracked into careers starting from their earliest years. I don't want that for our future, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Additional remarks?
So here is the Departments of Early Learning selling points directly from their website for sharing education dollars with the public schools. Early learning is important because there are economic advantages to schools and society. Schools save money, increased enrollments, public goodwill, support for levies and bonds. The actual effects of those selling points, it generates economic advantages to schools from society through increased enrollments into public schools. And public school is based on head count. So how do they increase their enrollment? Well, they do it by training parents that care for their children is free from birth in public institutions. Fewer parents will choose private school or homeschooling, therefore increasing public school enrollments, shutting down private childcares and private schools. Just as a side note, we've lost about 1,500 Catholic schools in our country in the last 5 years or so. So with public will and support for levies and bonds, this last point, do they mean public goodwill or do they mean public dependency on what they intend on creating as a near monopoly of services for working families? So those parents and their friends will be sure to vote and make sure everyone else is voting for school levies and bonds. It's for the kids. Does this seem like a political strategy perpetrated because of partnerships between the Department of Early Learning and OSPI, the public schools? Isn't it illegal for our state agencies to be involved in campaign strategies for tax initiatives that bolster their budgets? So we'll hit on the delivery method here. There's 3 areas of delivery. Early Achievers, the Early Start Act kicked off a lot of that, and Common Core, Baby Core, mandated curriculum. Early Achievers is a workforce development program designed to weed out the providers like us that will not fall in line with the one-size-fits-all curriculum and mandatory data tracking of the children and families. Part of the Early Start Act was mandatory enrollment into this Early Achievers program. I actually call it the Early Deceivers program because it's not really about the children. It's about the non-governmental organizations that operate the program for Dell at a cost of tens of millions of dollars. Technically, Dell cannot collect personal information on the daycare providers, their personal businesses, their finances, the children that they care for's medical records, and much other information, but their contractors can. The program is also designed to get the workforce ECE degrees, early childhood education, not early learning certificates, not childcare engineer certificates, early childhood education. And why is that? Who has the constitutional mandate to fund education? The state taxpayers. Once birth to 5 early learning is fully considered education, it will be an entitlement program and have mandatory attendance from birth. With that mandatory attendance comes baby core mandates and curriculum. Looks like a happy kid there. What many of the small child care business owners don't understand is that the Early Deceivers program is designed to create a workforce to replace their business. So they and their employees are just merely part of a transition to a government-run system. The new director of the Department of Early Learning, his name is Ross Hunter. I'll give you a handout on him later, or my wife will actually. He has stated that the state does not need private childcare. And Heather Moss, as you see earlier in the video, has made it clear who owns the children. So another aspect of the Early Deceivers program is that each facility participating signs a contract. That contract binds that child care provider to make changes to their business based upon what the recommendations of their coaches are. The Early Deceivers program staff, which are the coaches, visit the child care facilities, observe the business, the program, the operations, and then request you to make changes. And of course, you're forced to make those changes, or you'll receive a low rating and less incentive money. Got to dangle that carrot. These coaches have a purpose of worming their way into these facilities, convincing providers that their morals are not their values. And they actually put that in the training manual for these coaches, and they call it ghost busting. You need to put your morals aside and focus on the values of the program. It's in the training manual. So they're telling them you need to go to more trainings, more conferences. Providers are always learning, but are never seeing the big picture or the truth. But they're spending all of their personal free time in classes, educational institution, always learning and being taught to work with children in ways that actually contradict their natural instincts, because that's the way it looks like to teach children now. Always being assessed. What is happening is these constant observations and required data collection on children and families for a state agency is actually taking them further away from quality time with the children. Meanwhile, our legislature continues to be deceived with phrases like, it's for the kids, or seamless education, as they continue to pass and fund policies and regulations that require attendance in early learning facilities for birth to 5-year-olds. But actually, that's not all. There's more. Not only are these coaches forced on childcare businesses, but one of the other requirements of the Early Deceivers program is mandatory home visiting. Each provider in the Early Deceivers program is required to schedule home visits with each family enrolled to observe their home life. Sounds innocent enough. Providers are also required to input notes from their home visit into the online database to be stored with the Department of Early Learning's website and on their files for future use. So Dell is not the only agency that has access to those files. Child care providers are also mandated CPS reporters, Child Protective Service. Since they're assessing your home environment, do you own guns? Are you affiliated with a certain group or religion? What does your home life say about you? Providers can make recommendations on family living. Are your parenting skills appropriate? Are your family beliefs and heritage acceptable to maintain custody of your children? How far away is the complete takeover of parental choice and private options? Well, House Bill 2731 passed in 2010, making ECAP, the state program, an entitlement by 2020. Not quite a mandatory entitlement yet, but an entitlement. So this program comes with the baby core curriculum and the data collection mandates on all the children and families. This means that every child in the state will have a right to early learning state-funded services. Now we know who owns those children to make sure that that right is secured. The Department of Early Learning. So here's the catch. The Department of Early Learning and the ECAP application has this statement on it, and it's also inside the Early Start Act. Sectarian organizations, such as Protestant and Catholic schools, will be able to provide ECAP services as long as their ECAP program is free from religious content, instruction activities, and even symbolism. Take the cross off your neck, ladies. No symbolism. In regards to parental choice, even if parents choose a religious facility, the curriculum mandates and the intrusive data collection and testing will be the same. So what then is the reason for the parents to choose the private sector and these sectarian organizations for their child care or ECAP? Published in the News Tribune in November of 2015, Ross Hunter, director of Department of Early Learning, announced work to further align child care licensing standards with the state ECAP model. This alignment will dictate to religious organizations what they can teach. In order to comply with basic licensing standards, they must all be free from religious content, instruction activities, or symbolism, and participate in all the data tracking, just like the state-run facilities. So private schools offering birth to 5 programs and private child care programs will be the same. Another issue is the moral and societal ideas in the curriculum. How many religious schools do you think will be teaching humanistic and politically correct educational lessons, ones that maybe include 2 mommies and 2 daddies? By the way, any curriculum that the state approves has to be respectful of the transgender population and have no gender identifications in it. With that in mind, everybody knows this just happened. The Washington State Human Rights Commission just changed the law based on anti-discrimination and opened up all restrooms to the opposite sex, which includes churches and childcares. I call it the pedophile loophole. Childcare facilities have already been encouraged to have multi-use bathrooms. As you see here, the boys and girls are using toilets right next to each other with no dividers. In this case, all they need to do is remove the gender-specific labels. I've sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the minds of man. That's Thomas Jefferson. When government agencies control the inputs and outputs of children, birth and beyond, how will families continue traditions that don't fit the politically correct education that their impressionable 3-year-old is receiving in a mandatory education system? The monopolizing of education is tyranny over future generations. The massive data collection is being done so those in control of the content will be able to analyze the differences and effects of those educational inputs in a centrally controlled system and then make changes as they think society should change. Just a few months ago, there was an early learning summit here in Spokane. It was called State of Children and Families. One of the speakers told the group that one of the major barriers to successful early learning programs is that parents still have too much time to influence their children. Also, there was a handout. This handout is talking about the idea of human capital. It's called the Heckman Equation Project. When Professor Heckman presents his research on economics of early learning in childhood to policymakers and advocates, one question is often asked. If we had X dollars to invest in reducing inequality and promoting human capital development, where should we invest it? When discussing human capital, the real issue of controlling people from birth is to change their morals and values. If the subjects, those children, if the subjects believe that their personal life, their family, their religion, things like that, it's their main priorities, then they do not see that the state and large corporations want to be the main stakeholders in their economic existence. So let's take a look at the quote from the former Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. Hopefully someday we can track children from preschool to high school, from high school to college, college to career. With that being said, let me introduce you to our state's data system. So I'm going to be brief on this because it's a massive system. It's called the P20 data system. P20W stands for Washington. The purpose is to track all documented inputs and outputs of every single child in the state, and it's designed to go far beyond education. Let's look at their recent data initiatives. Multi-state data exchange project, so that, the government, every state can do the same thing. State need grant studies, state-funded preschool evaluation. That's all the testing your little preschooler gets to have. Invest database, so what are they investing in each individual student? Roadmap project, student transitions info project, and Department of Corrections research. That seems to fit with 2- and 3-year-olds. And many more. And many more includes medical information, mental health history, family history, cultural backgrounds, maybe your voting record of your parents, I don't know. So what have these initiatives led to? With all the testing and assessments and strict curriculum timelines, when do the children get to actually explore life? Here we have a cartoon, all the teachers, or the teacher with all the students hooked up to the equipment, Come away from the window. You don't want to be a child left behind, do you? I think I'd be crawling out the window. Sounds good to me, says the child. And I think she's probably trying to follow me. I was already out the window. So the educational machine has forgotten about what children actually need, which is playtime, and they need to learn how to build relationships. They have to build relationships. Instead, the focus is on monopolizing contractors for curriculum, data, and other infrastructure. Contractors for buildings, databases. I guess that's where the big corporations come in, and the publishers. The data collected in the warehouse begins as soon as birth and continues through basic education. Kind of notice the dosage up there. They got to get the right prescription. Just go back, take 2 more of these, 2 more of those. Going to move on, and here, of course, the data collection continues through college, then into the workforce. Now, here's where it gets interesting to me. How can we as parents authorize data collection on our children as adults? Or maybe they're forced to. Wouldn't they need to authorize and release that information themselves? Let's reflect back earlier in the presentation and remember who the children belong to. We need to realize that what we've allowed to happen is that even as adults, our children no longer belong to themselves. So here's our workforce pipeline. Get hooked up to Bill Gates' machine here, and the parents want to know what their kid is going to be, and the doctor says, well, I guess a fry cook or a parking lot attendant. They must live in a low-income area. There are many organizations receiving funds from private entities, and a lot of you guys, taxpayers. A lot of organizations: Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, Strengthening Families Washington, Thrive by 5, Kids Matter, Washington Learns, and dozens more, using the terms womb to workforce. Another one they like to use is cradle to career systems and support. So we'll just move right on to the tracking model. This is the current P20 data components. And as you can see, this is just right off the state's website. It's a complex network showing how information will be tracked and analyzed on these children. So this is just a small portion of what the state already has in the works. In the top left, you see ECAP, the state-run Birth to 5 system. So I don't want to get into too many details because, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff there they want to know about your children. So take a look at the far right column labeled Other. You see labor and industries, apprenticeship programs, and then the big blank section for things that they either don't want to tell us about on their website yet or things to be decided later. Then look at the bottom section on the left. It's labeled Outcome. I'm sure some of you folks remember outcome-based education before No Child Left, or Every Child Left Behind, and all the other initiatives. Look to the right. Do you see Department of Retirement Systems? More and more in documents, we are not referred to as individuals or people or children. Future generations are referred to as human capital and subjects. So I have some action items for you, of course. If you know any group that would be interested in this presentation, please contact us. We are already scheduled for at least one more, and I'd like to get this information out to as many people as we can. Talk to people, inform people what's happening. When they drop their kid off and aren't allowed to go into the building at the old Yokes in the valley, let them know what's happening to their children. Ask your legislators where they stand on early learning, because they're not hearing from us. They hear from lobbyists that convince them this is for the kid. They hear from your county sheriff and all the county sheriffs across the state that are hired by Fight Crime, Invest in Kids. Actually, your tax dollars through Ozzie Knezovich helps fund Fight Crime, Invest in Kids and the sheriffs to testify that if these children are in these institutions from birth, they won't go to prison. We'll save money. That's what they're being told. And they believe it because they're not hearing from us. So talk to your legislators and pressure them to stand for the rights of parents and families of future generations, and to stand for private school options and private child care. So I want to thank you, ladies, for caring for yesterday's children. And I want to thank you in advance for caring for the rights of families and children of future generations. And I have one last thing. So I want to ask you if this looks like education. According to the Department of Early Learning's professional development page, it does. What about the upside down elephant in the corner? Is that supposed to be subliminal? Because we're sure seeing a lot of suggestive materials in early learning these days. I'm going to leave this slide up. Pay close attention to the details. Do you know your ABCs? And where does education begin? And who should be in charge of children's social development? Do we have time for questions?